Welcome to Decoding Retirement, where we hope to go behind the headlines to help you plan for and live in retirement a little bit better. The headline that we'll be talking about today is whether it can ever be too early or too late to plan for and save for retirement. And my guest is Michael Liersch from Wells Fargo. Michael, welcome.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and it'll be a pleasure to have you answer this question. Can it be too early or too late? I get this all the time, this question.
Well, people love that question. And in a lot of ways, I understand the question, but it's important to ask a different question, which is, are you using that as an excuse not to plan, Bob? And a lot of people try to find reasons not to plan and find fewer reasons to actually do it. So
it's hard work.
It is hard work. It's very hard work. I mean,
how much do I need to save? How do I invest?
Well, even forgetting all that, you actually have to articulate what you want to accomplish in retirement. You know, goals. And when you want to do it.
And I'm in my 20s, and you're asking me to figure out what I'm going to do at
Who
age
knows?
67.
I'm just trying to pay my rent, or buy that first home, or buy a car,
Barcelona.
or go see Taylor Swift.
Right.
You know, whatever it may be. So I'm totally with you. So there's a lot of challenges. So we have to help people understand. You know, too late, too early. Let's move that aside. It's important to plan now and plan incrementally, Bob. And that gets us over the hump of it's a lot of work. What's one thing you can do to be a bit more intentional about your retirement planning? Does that make any kind of sense? And if it doesn't,
but what would that be?
So the first step is, what do you want to accomplish in retirement? And so when you think about that, it can involve a lot of different things, but most easily, how much do you think you're going to need to spend in retirement? That's always a reasonable starting point. And then ultimately, when do you really want to retire? Forget about when you're going to retire, but when do you want to do that? Those two pieces of information give a lot of important next steps in terms of evaluating where you're at and how you can get to where you want to go, and if that's even possible or not.
Is there a trick of the trade to help people?
Yeah, I have a couple of them.
All right.
Are you ready? I'm a behavioral scientist after all, so we got a lot of tricks up our sleeves, but we don't call them tricks, right? They're ways in which to provide self-insight, right?
Nudges. You're a fan of Richard Thaler.
Sure, yes. I am a big fan of Richard Thaler. He's an amazing human being, researcher, and professional.
I'll tell you a story, my Richard Thaler story later. I'm sure you have one too.
Oh, I'd love to hear it. Yeah. Well, we'll get there in just a second. Okay. So one of the key pieces of information that everyone should be asking themselves, and then their partner or spouse or even family, is, what is the number one thing you want to get done with your money? What's the most important thing you want to get done with your money? What would you say to that, Bob?
Well, I often think it's my answer, but it's also other people's answer. I want to get to retirement and not have to worry about money.
Okay, so some sort of peace of mind, or not having financial freedom, not having any concerns.
Don't want to look at my statements. Just want to be able to do what I want to do.
Amazing.
Travel, grandkids, garden, volunteer work.
Okay, great. So then there's a second question. I love that. Do you have enough to get that done? Just enough, more than enough, or not enough? Do you know the answer to that, Bob?
Well, I think it's a hard question to answer, right? Because it depends on, I think, one is your planning horizon. Will I die at age 72 or age 95?
Sure.
If I plan on dying at age 72, I think I have more than enough.
Yes. If
I plan on dying at age 100, a little bit harder.
Yes. So, and to your point, it's very difficult to plan for when you'll ultimately pass, or when a spouse or partner will pass, because sometimes if you're in that type of relationship, you have to consider that. Maybe you have a special needs child, right? There's a lot of things to consider within the framework you just highlighted that creates that worry and concern. So ultimately, you don't know, right, Bob? That's what you just told me.
Yeah.
You don't know.
There's
I don't know if I don't know.
uncertainty around what you want to be certain.
And therein lies the inertia. Uncertainty creates inertia. Human beings are uncertainty reduction machines. We like to stick our heads in the sand. You know the ostrich effect, which ostriches don't actually do, but stick your head in the sand to avoid danger when you feel like it's impending. That's what causes it. So what we try to do by asking these questions is acknowledge that uncertainty is causing inertia. And so then there's a third question, which is, well, who do you think outside of yourself should be entitled to know this information, or who could collaborate with you around what you want to accomplish and whether you have enough to get there? And do you want to know what the most common answer is?
Financial advisor?
Well, so it isn't actually. That's not the most common answer. The most common answer is some type of family member. Because your kids, if you're planning for your retirement, if you run out of money, they may need to step in, right? It might be good information for them to have. Maybe, a lot of people don't share financial information in partnerships, or spouses don't do that. So maybe that person might need to know it. Maybe if you're taking care of an aging parent and you're overgiving to them, maybe they need to know you're risking your own financial solvency. So there's a lot of conversations that can be had that can open the door to then leaning more into the tough stuff that we're alluding to, which is, my spending patterns and how much am I saving, what am I investing, ultimately, what does my balance sheet looks like, my assets and liabilities, and am I going to be able to get to where I want to go in terms of when I want to retire and how I want that to look.
Yeah.
So I hope that makes a little sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And as you were talking about uncertainty and it creating inertia, I was thinking about Jeff Bezos, who sometimes says Amazon is a regret aversion machine.
Yeah. I haven't heard him say that. So tell me a little more, because I love that idea.
Well, the notion is that you would regret not buying something that you saw on Amazon. So we avert that regret by
I see.
making you buy something.
Well, there's another element to that too. To avoid regret, it's also important to look at a curated set of options that are for you. And so Amazon is very clever at presenting that to you as well. So there's a lot of techniques within that framework. Also return policies, right? How quickly you receive it. So they create a lot of user choice in order to minimize that regret.
So how do we actually, we'll save that question for another time, because the thing that you were leading toward is money is a taboo topic. So how do we get parents and their children to talk, or parents and their their older adults to talk?
So the way you do it, and that's what the trick is of those questions, you make it crystal clear that there's a lot of uncertainty around something that's extremely important to you. Bob, you just said that. You told me what the number one thing is that you wanted to accomplish with money, and you don't know if you can get there or not. And so it opens the door to say, okay, well, let's normalize that. That's okay. But now that you identify, I didn't want to push you on who you needed to talk to about it, but let's say it is a financial advisor or some type of professional, or let's say it is a spouse or a partner or your family members. Then we can start getting into, well, then what's the next step to take action on that discussion? How do you start collecting the financial information required? And what system do you need to put that in, whether it's some sort of planning tool, self driven, or whether that's driven by a professional, to evaluate it so that you can make the right decisions. Retire later, save more, spend less.
Work longer, die sooner.
Invest differently, right? There's a lot of options. Yes.
So when you talk about these goals, how do people align their financial decision with these goals? And how do they evaluate whether they're making the right decision as they go? Because it seems to me like it's not a set and forget thing. It's like a constant reevaluation of the decisions I'm making.
Absolutely. So this is where it gets really taboo, because people change, ideas change. They change for a lot of different reasons. As you age, as you maybe accumulate more or actually decumulate money, intentionally, unintentionally. And so what happens is people are concerned. A big piece of research we receive is people are concerned that there's going to be a lot of friction if they really share their ideas, thoughts, concerns, needs around money, even with the people closest to them. And so when we try to overcome that idea, it's really important to say, well, what's the frictionless environment to start sharing those ideas in a safe space? And so I just encourage all your listeners to really think about that. What would that safe space look like? And oftentimes it is setting up a dedicated time, no alcohol.
No, and not Thanksgiving.
And not Thanksgiving, yes. And set an agenda. Here's what we're going to talk about today is what we think we want to do with money, and are we actually doing that? Yeah. And then start setting up concrete steps. And then you get closer to what you just highlighted, which is how am I connecting my goals and what you implied is my financial and investment behaviors. Because you can start seeing together how disconnected they may be or how connected they may be. Do more of what's connected, do less of what's disconnected, and do that in a more collaborative way.
Yeah. So I don't know if this would be a motivating factor, but oftentimes these conversations don't take place until there's a crisis.
Correct.
And
that is the most common.
Right.
Yes.
And you want to avoid the
what we call a moment.
The moment.
Yes.
And so maybe one, talk about how you can be motivated to talk before the crises, and two, the degree to which you might need a mediator who can help with the alpha child and some of the more difficult topics that need to be raised.
And this is where professionals definitely help quite a bit. So we'll take a step back. How do I have this type of dialogue and start setting my plan, my financial plan, in line with my goals, either for myself or for a group of people who are working together before the moment? To your point, before the crisis. And in fact, a crisis can actually be coming into a lot of money, Bob, too. Mm-hmm. Think of lottery winners.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
They end up broke.
Well, and when you see them, there's a lot of stress and anxiety associated with it, and some are required to be public about it. And imagine all those human beings that come to them asking them for money for very valid reasons. Maybe they have a sick family member, and I see a lot of this behind the scenes, right? I get to see a lot of data, and it's real. And so we have to have a lot of empathy. And so to really think about this beforehand, it's important to imagine, are you set up for the circumstance in very predictable moments? So one that we all often ask people to think about is, so if you were to run out of money, who would take care of you? Do they know that? Have you asked their permission?
The oldest daughter, typically.
Yeah.
As an unpaid caregiver,
and,
right?
And so that may be an assumption in a family, but is that even true? We talk about this with business owners who are thinking of transitioning a business. And we may ask questions like, okay, so you want the business to go beyond your retirement, your life. Have you ever talked to the child that you're thinking of taking over the business? That's your expectation. What's the common answer, Bob? What do you think? Have they talked to them or not?
Oh, probably not. They haven't talked to them about, whether they want to leave them the house or there's the second home or whatever it is, right? It's
exactly. So then this provokes people to say, okay, well, that's going to be a pretty predictable outcome. Like it's going to happen. So let's get started now. And then you can start setting up the very tiny micro steps to get there. And again, it really starts with this just conversation, half an hour discussion. What do we want to do with our money? And is what we're doing aligned with that? And are we all on the same page ultimately, Bob? Because then that helps us then figure out how we either get more aligned or just accept the fact that maybe we're all on a different page and we're going to agree to disagree and figure out how to move forward together in that type of way.
Yeah. So when you have these conversations, oftentimes there's an alpha child in the family.
There may be. I mean, I wouldn't say oftentimes, but sometimes. In the data and the research, about half the time there's no obvious person actually in a family who would take on some of these topics that we're describing.
Right. But you do want things to be done in a, equitable way or a way that allows everyone to sort of speak their mind.
So what does equitable mean to you? Because that's a very complex topic.
Well, I think equitable would be this notion of everyone being allowed to speak their mind, right? Everyone has a say.
Well, do they?
Well, I would think that would be the case, right? That if you're going to talk about money or you're going to talk about inheritance or you're going to talk about caregiving plans or whatever it might be, everyone has at least a voice at the table.
So some families, that's true, Bob, and some families, that's not true. So what's really important to your point, and I love that you're bringing this up, and again, this is like my favorite topic of conversation. So when you think about this, there's a difference between equity and fairness.
Fair.
And actually, people have a really sophisticated mental model of this, especially those on the receiving end of these types of conversations or being brought into them. They understand the difference. So they know there's someone maybe who's putting in more time and effort and energy into the family, who's, that sweat equity, maybe we'd call it. They get it. They understand who actually needs the money more than someone else. And I mentioned a special needs child. People have very sophisticated mental models of that. They understand who's psychologically ready to take on those roles or not. And so when you think about a lot of these ideas, I wouldn't make any assumptions coming into the conversation. I would really say, if everyone has a voice, Bob, do they have decision-making rights too? So that's something to really differentiate with. So it's different to have a voice at the table and to actually be a part of the decision making. So I would just be, when you have these conversations, be very clear up front. Like I'm willing to hear you, but it may have no impact on what we're going to do next. Does that make sense?
It does. So we have about 30 seconds left.
Yeah.
What's your number one practical life hack to help people stay on track with their goals?
Oh, number one? Mm-hmm. I would go on some type of mobile device or on a piece of paper, and I would answer the two questions that I first started with. What are you trying to get done with your money, and or what's the most important thing to you when it comes to your money that you want to get done, and do you have enough? Just enough, more than enough, or not enough? Write it down now, and if you have no one to talk to about it, go find somebody right now that you trust to help you navigate those answers to those questions. And if you do, set up a conversation with them tomorrow and have the discussion.
Michael, I'm so grateful that you came by to share your knowledge and wisdom with us. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate being invited.
And hopefully you'll come back on in another 3 months or so and tell us more about behavioral hacks. And maybe we'll talk about Richard Thaler.
All right, perfect. Sounds great. Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Thank you. Welcome back to Decoding Retirement. I'm now joined by Molly Moorhead, an editor at Yahoo Finance, in charge of personal finance.
Hi.
Molly, welcome.
Thank you.
So, open enrollment in season is almost upon us, and many folks who might have the ability to enroll in a high deductible health plan will learn about something called a health savings account. Tell us what that is.
Well, I think a health savings account is a highly misunderstood vehicle. I think of it more as a retirement vehicle. I don't know about you. But it is tied to what's often your employer health plan. But you don't have to use it in the current year, and really you shouldn't.
Yeah.
Because it's actually money that you can invest to use in retirement to pay for medical expenses when your medical expenses are likely to be higher.
So if I recall correctly, I think President Bush, when he announced the arrival of health savings accounts, described them as IRAs for healthcare expenses in retirement.
Yeah.
And one of the benefits, as you well know, is that they're triple tax advantage, right? They're tax-free on the way in. They're
Grow
tax-free, and distributions are tax-free as long as they're used for qualified medical expenses.
Right.
The interesting thing about it is very few people, there are about 36 million accounts now in the U.S., and that the average balance is $4,607 in the most recent study, which means that people aren't necessarily using them for healthcare expenses in retirement, they're using them for current expenses.
Yeah, which is fine. You can do it. You'll be using pre-tax money to pay doctor bills and that kind of thing. But I think you get more bang if you save it for the future. And there's actually no drawback to waiting, because let's say you do keep the money invested to take out in retirement. If you need it for something else when you're retired, all you pay is regular income taxes on it. So there's no penalty after 65 for using it for anything. Not, say you need to, do something to your kitchen, renovate your kitchen. You could use HSA money. You'll pay income taxes on it because you never did pay taxes, but no penalty.
Yeah. One of the tricks of the trade that I'm fond of is this notion of, if you were to save this money for healthcare expenses in retirement, you could also save up all your medical receipts throughout your career, and then pay for those.
Pay yourself
back for all those expenses that you had while you were paying for them before you were 65, let's say. The interesting thing from my perspective, I had an HSA at one point when I had young children, 4 kids at home, and I never ended the year with $1
any money
in the HSA because we ended up using them for braces and broken arms and whatnot. So I understand why the balances are so low, but I do know that some people are accumulating 6 figures plus in their HSA account. And the interesting thing there is people sometimes think that they have to invest in something that's safe, but an HSA is like an IRA. You can invest in a target date fund,
kind of anything you want.
Or anything you want.
Yeah.
So people need to think about that. Don't just invest. If it's for the long term, invest as you would for the long term.
Like you would anything else for retirement.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the other thing too is, in some cases, employers are offering a match for people to contribute to their HSA at the same time that they're offering them a match to contribute to their 401k. Do you have any thoughts about
how do you pick
the contribution?
Yeah. Well, I think you want to contribute at least up to the amount to get the match, and so maybe you do that amount in your HSA, and whatever else you can do beyond that, you do in your 401k. If you can do more, but never leave money on the table in either case. So, put money in both so you're getting the full match of both if you're lucky enough to be in one of those jobs that offers it.
Yeah, and it makes sense. At the moment, only I think 1/3 of employers offer a match on their on the HSA, and that the average contribution or match was about $866. This is according to the research I did.
Weird amount,
which is a very small amount. But the interesting thing is when you think about the contribution, some firms do dollar for dollar, some do it as a percentage basis, some do a tiered thing, and some do a flat sort of fee, flat contribution. So there's all kinds of matches going on. But I agree with you. I think at least get the maximum match that you can on your HSA first, because it's triple tax advantage.
Yes, and most of us can't afford to max out our 401k annually anyway. And so if you're putting a little less in your 401k, this is going to pay off later on.
Yeah.
So
in terms of folks during open enrollment season, they're faced with a decision to either get an indemnity plan or a high deductible health plan. Do you have any thoughts about how someone could go about making that choice?
Well, I mean, that's the problem with these with HSAs being tied to your current health plan, because when you're making that choice, you're thinking, what are my health expenses going to be in the coming year? And that's really kind of disconnected from what your health expenses are going to be in retirement. So I think, the ideal to me would be pick the plan that serves your needs the most right now. If you have young kids or, health conditions, then maybe you want like a PPO that's going to cover more of it and not leave you with the big deductible, not have to pay a big deductible. But like at one point I had a high deductible health plan, and when I like really caught on to what HSAs can do, I had that plan and I put money in the HSA and just didn't touch it. And if you can do that, you're saving for the future.
Right. So is it possible that you could sort of mix and match when you're young and have no obligations, no children, et cetera, you use your high deductible health plan, but maybe when you're older and have children, you might use the PPO because you're going to go to
the doctor a lot. Yeah.
And you don't want to necessarily tap into your HSA, which could be used for years later.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing is you've seen the studies from Fidelity and other sources where healthcare expenses in retirement are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. They go up after you retire.
Right. So, I mean, do you sort of look at it and say, using an HSA allows me to maybe pay for some of those extraordinary expenses that I'll face in retirement? People need to sort of put that sort of front of mind as they think about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And you can kind of back that money out of whatever else you have saved for retirement. So, you won't be tapping your IRA, you won't be tapping your pension that you need to live on because you've got this money set aside specifically for healthcare.
Yeah. I sometimes think about it like I look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics consumer expenditure surveys where they look at expenditures in retirement, and healthcare represents about 5% of someone's budget in the early years of retirement, but it escalates up to 15% in the later years of retirement.
That's daunting.
It's daunting because, and some of that escalation is, one, inflation of healthcare expenses, but also as you age, you're probably spending a little bit more on healthcare expenses.
Yeah, you need more things break down. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think, Molly, I think that sort of brings us to the end of our discussion on HSAs. Thanks ever so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Great. So up next, we're going to answer a reader question in a segment that we call Ask Bob. The question this time goes like this. The Secure 2.0 legislation has a number of provisions, one of which addresses something I'm interested in buying, long-term care insurance. What do I need to know? Well, Richard Kaplan at the University of Illinois Law School helped me answer this question. He says that the big change is this. Retirement plan distributions used to pay for long-term care insurance are exempt from the 10% penalty that applies to early distribution. That is, distributions prior to attaining age 59 and a half. People over age 59 and a half, however, could already take out money without penalties. So it's a bit of a curious provision, Kaplan told me. So while this penalty relief is certainly worth something, the distribution used to pay for long-term care insurance remains subject to federal income tax and possibly to state income tax as well, depending on the tax laws of the individual states. If you have a question about money, about retirement, email me at askbob@yahoofinance.com. We'll do our best to answer your question on a future episode. That's it for this week's episode of Decoding Retirement, with hope you've learned a little bit more to help you plan for and live in retirement. Be sure to stay tuned for future episodes, and be sure to keep an eye on yahoofinance.com for more retirement news and information.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.